A sudden dreadful calm is broken by the roar of 50,000 Romans. A gladiator named Ferox is kneeling in the blood-soaked sand in the middle of the Colosseum, waiting for one thumb to determine his fate. The crowd adores him because he has lived for 6 years and 43 fights. Today, however, the thumb goes down, and the cruel calculation of his existence is revealed in that last instant. It was a falsehood, a splendor. He never was a hero. He was a piece of livestock, an asset that had recently lost value. His final thought as the blade reaches his neck is of a slave market 6 years prior, where he was bought for 10 cents less than the man who was killing him. Rome would make money even after he died, selling his bones as powder and his blood by the cup. He never had a personality. He was the last bloody dividend that an investment could pay. For thousands of warriors who gave their lives for Rome's amusement, this was the harsh reality. However, how did the empire refine this death-dealing apparatus? What psychological techniques did they employ to turn terrified slave boys into murderers who would yearn for the thunder of the exact mobs that condemned them to death? We must go back to the early days of the slave market, when human life had a value and a lengthy violent career in the arena was only beginning. In order to comprehend 120 denarii in the slave market of Rome, that was the price of a human life, not a really good horse. As vendors set out their living wares, the early sun cast long shadows across the forum. A 16-year-old Germanic lad was standing among them, his wrists shackled and his eyes wide with the type of horror that comes when you realize your life suddenly has a cost. Like a butcher describing slices of meat, the auctioneers' voices echoed through the throng as they listed qualities: good teeth, strong shoulders, an ideal training age. The real terror started when prospective purchasers came forward. His joints were explored by fingertips to measure their flexibility. They calculated his potential by applying pressure to his muscles. One purchaser opened his mouth and looked at his teeth as a veterinarian would with livestock. He jumped at another, looking for any concealed wounds. A further layer of humanity was removed with each touch. The youngster attempted to hide from the examination. He still had a name at the time, but it would soon be lost. However, how do you become ready? To become a property, how can you prepare for the time when your value is quantified? There was a calculation in the buyer's eyes that went beyond straightforward business. The most successful gladiator school in Rome was operated by Marcus Cassius Aquila. He saw no terrified adolescent. He noticed possible profit margins. Examining the boy's musculature revealed a stubbornness that was hardly concealed by dread. These were investments that needed time to grow. "Turn around," said Aquilus. For a single heartbeat, the boy paused. The bargain was sealed by that moment of resistance. Spirit files were necessary for gladiators, just enough to endure the breaking process, nothing more. The discussion started. Given the boy's young and apparent power, the seller began at 150 denarii. Aquilus retorted with 100, highlighting the expense of training and the possibility of dying prior to financial success. They agreed on 120 quills, which is equivalent to 3 months' worth of a laborer's salary and the price of turning a human being into a commodity. Something fundamental altered in the universe as the coins were exchanged. With increasing fear, the boy saw the transaction. This was neither slavery nor capture. This was business. He had turned into a product, as casual and acceptable as purchasing wine or grain. The audience proceeded to other sales. A Gaulish woman paid 90 denarii. The two were given 200 by twin brothers from Thrace. Through mere repetition, each sale normalized the one before it, establishing a market in which people were reduced to commodities. His very name would be destroyed by what transpired next. With a gesture, Aquilus' guards seized the boy's arms. With well-honed efficiency, other slaves looked away as they pulled him toward a blazing brazier at the edge of the market. They were aware of what would happen next. Iron grips kept the youngster steady as he struggled. First came the odor. Charcoal and hot metal combined with another substance, sweat, fear, and the remains of those who had previously stood here. The brandmaster lifted the flaming iron from the coals and declared it to be property of Marcus Cassius Aquilus. It had a straightforward design. A gladius, a maker's mark for human goods. Surrounds MCA. Absurdly pragmatic was the boy's final free thought prior to the iron touching his skin, not simply because of the brand, but also because of what he was about to become. His mother would never recognize him now. When metal and flesh collided, steam rose. Even though it lasted only for a few seconds, the sizzle seemed to endure forever. The forum's common sense, spices, perspiration, and animals, along with the stench of burning skin, created a sickening normalcy that would follow him around for the rest of his life. Coins, however, would not cover the full cost of his purchase. Over the course of 6 grueling years, it would be gathered in drops of blood. They shoved the iron into his shoulder, and it flashed orange hot. The precise moment he ceased to be human was marked by the sizzle of flesh. Even though the pain was like lightning, the boy bit down hard and refrained from screaming, not because he was brave. His voice was frozen with fear. The slave market was still operating around him. Nearby, merchants hawked ceramics. Between the stalls, kids played. Human branding had become so commonplace that it no longer even drew stares. Marcus Cassius Aquaculus looked on with the disinterested concentration of a craftsman in charge of quality assurance. The brand has to be deep enough to leave a permanent scar without harming the muscle underneath. Damaged items resulted in cheaper arena costs. The brandmaster mumbled, "Hold him steady," and applied more pressure. The guards held the youngster upright even when his knees gave way. This choreography was practiced. They were fully aware of the amount of pressure required to keep a slave upright throughout the procedure. The forum's common sense blended with the stench to create a sickening normalcy. Roasting meat from food vendors, tannery, leather, and human flesh with ownership labels. It's all a part of the commercial symphony of Rome. The peculiar chill that followed the scorching caused the youngster to gasp when the iron finally lifted. Not out of relief, the brandmaster sprayed the wound with vinegar, resulting in new pain. He told no one specifically that it prevents infection. Slaves who are dead don't train. The boy's gaze lowered to his shoulder. The surrounding design was what made his stomach turn, even if the letters MCA stood tall and irate on his flesh. The initials were ringed by a gladius with a sword. He had been identified not just as property but also as a particular type of property, such as a future corpse or a fighting slave. Achilles took a step forward, studying the brand like he would a maker's mark on pottery he had bought. He said a single word that would haunt the child for the rest of his life. Satisfied, Ferox in that moment, the boy's true name, the one his father had called across Germanic forests, the one his mother had spoken at his birth. Tide. Ferox signified rough, untamed, and terrible. There was no name for it. It was a description of a product. Aquilos went on, his Latin clear and incisive. You'll answer to this now. A free guy has your previous name. Where you're going, there are no free guys. The scorching on Fox's shoulder made him realize a basic fact, despite his desire to object and insist on his identity. Things that are branded are not allowed to pick their own names. There were more brandings when iron touched a woman's back. She shrieked. The kid, whimpering as they marked his forearm, he could not have been older than 12. 6 slaves could be branded in the time it took to properly make bread, demonstrating how effective the methodical erasure of individuality had become. But physical marking was only one aspect of branding. This will happen in the next several days. He would be identified as property by the elevated scar tissue left over after the burn healed. However, the psychological brand, the deeper wound, would never go away. Every time he answered the phone and someone called him Ferox, he would engage in his own erasure. Fox saw his owner for the first time when the guards started escorting him out of the market. With the self-assured economy of someone who had turned hundreds of boys into gladiators, Achilles moved. His clothing was well made but not showy. He still trained with his fighters, and his hands were calloused. This was not a remote nobleman tampering with people's lives. He was a professional murderer's manufacturer, Aquilus said. First lesson, as they strolled, ignore your identity. That individual has passed away. I paid 120 dinars for his body. The value of what I'm producing is far higher. They moved through the crowds in the forum, politics being discussed by senators, women purchasing veggies, and kids using wooden swords to fight. They didn't actually see Ferox in a strange way. The brand had rendered him invisible. He had become as inconspicuous as the roads or the aqueducts in Rome's infrastructure. One word from his new master would follow him around for the rest of his life. Stroll. It was the nonchalant surety of the command, not its cruelty. Aquilus was sure he would comply. That was taken care of by the brand. The 20-foot-tall iron gates of the Ludus Magnus, the great gladiator school, loomed ahead, resembling the mouth of some monstrous beast that would soon discover it was not far from the reality. He was unaware that he was entering a factory built to produce only one thing as they escorted him past iron gates and toward stone walls that grazed the sky. Barracks intended for 100 men were overcrowded with 200 guys. The crowding wasn't an accident, it was a battle of the mind. The smell hit him like a physical blow as soon as he stepped through the gates. No amount of scrubbing could get rid of the acidic temps of fear fragrance that was combined with sweat, blood, and human feces. The walls were 15 feet high, with iron spikes on top that bent inward to keep the gladiators in rather than others out. In front of him was a packed dirt courtyard that was darkly stained with what could only be blood. Men performed training exercises with robotic accuracy, yet they watched the newcomer. Fresh meat for the grinder, another body. With an almost proud gesture toward the facility, Aquilus continued, "Welcome to your new home. Rome's best gladiator. School here, men murder for the possibility of dying. Only later will it become evident how bitterly ironic those statements were." Fox concentrated on the architecture itself for the time being. Every component appeared to be intended to shatter hope. The walls were more than just obstacles, they were educators. Their height served as a daily reminder that he no longer had access to the sky. Light came in through windows that were too high to reach, yet there were never any views. Men had to enter in single file since the doors were narrow. No opportunity for concerted opposition. Men were trapped like rainfall in a basin formed by the subtle sloping of the land toward the center. The actual terror started when a trainer pushed in the direction of the barracks. Sleeping platforms were arranged 3 high along both walls. Of the long, narrow structure, there were hardly enough spaces for a guy to lie flat. Just body against flesh in a willful breach of human dignity, no privacy, no personal space. The trainer yelled, "Find a spot that is empty. Create one if there isn't already." Ferox tried not to gag at the stench as he made his way through the mass of bodies. On their platforms, men sat, some tending to wounds, others honing weapons. In the tiny aisle, some played dice. With the flat appraisal of people determining whether he would be a corpse or a competitor, everyone observed him. On a central level, he discovered a gap between a pale ghoul with 2 missing fingers and a scarred Nubian. He was not recognized by either here. Personal relationships were risky. One more act of deliberate brutality. How do you rebel with men you've been taught to view negatively? The walls were more than just obstacles, they were educators. There were signs of despair on every surface. Days are counted by scratch tallies, the names of men who have been forgotten, rudimentary sketches of houses that are now only remembered, deeply etched and discolored with what may have been blood. One writing simply said, "Mother." As night fell, the overcrowding's true genius became apparent. It was impossible to sleep. However, that was precisely the purpose. Bodies moved all the time, looking for solace that was not there. The symphony of tiredness was accompanied by grunts, snores, and nightmare cries. Men could hardly dream of freedom if they were unable to sleep deeply. At last, the Nubian next to him spoke. He spoke with a distinct Latin accent. Fox nodded the first night. "It just gets worse," the man added. "After that, you cease to notice. You can tell they've won at that point." As recollections of freedom, stars emerged through the 2 tall windows, far away and inaccessible. Even imagination seemed like rebellion as the walls pressed in, preventing Fox from visualizing the woodlands of his birthplace. A brawl erupted close to the entrance, a couple of men fighting over a piece of bread. Nobody stepped in. Outside, the guards didn't even glance. This was also deliberate. Allow them to tire one another. Never direct aggression vertically. Instead, channel it horizontally. A voice called, the lights went off, and the barracks was engulfed in darkness. But there was no respite from the darkness. In fact, it made the claustrophobia worse. Pahath, that number. There are 200 guys breathing in space. The presence of people made the air thick, almost souped, like someone silently sobbed. A fresh sound, youthful, another newcomer. Finding out that while warriors could murder, they could never cry. Fox couldn't tell if the sudden silence was due to self-control or someone's fist. The brand had burned his shoulder, causing it to throb as he lay awake. The architecture had already begun to operate on him, surrounded by individuals who had turned into weapons. Overcrowding and wars worked together to blur the lines separating the ego from the system. It became impossible to sleep, but that was the whole goal. Men who are tired don't plot escapes. They don't band together. They simply make it through. Time itself turns into another wall as one day crumbles into the next. Before daybreak, a bell rang. Rain pitted and bronzed as they folded blankets and got ready for another day of metamorphosis. Men moved with practiced efficiency. Farok saw them, recognizing his future in their instinctive motions. His actual education would start tomorrow. His neurological system would be rewired into something less than human after 10,000 repetitions. Step, block, step, block, step, thrust. Thought vanishes at the 1,000th repetition. You are no longer carrying a weapon by the 10,000th. Weapon is you. Fear was in line with 20 other rookies when dawn broke over the practice yard. The fundamental thrust was performed by their trainer Titus, a former gladiator whose scars revealed tales of survival. Straightforward, and lethal. With his wooden gladius slicing the air with well-honed accuracy, Titus declared, "This is your new language. Your weapon speaks now. Forget words." They began with 6-foot-tall, leather-wrapped wooden pillars that stood like silent foes. With a wooden blade in hand, each novice faced the other, starting the repetition that would change their bodies and minds. Make a thrust. The dull thud of the wooden sword struck the post. Block. A hypothetical counterattack was thwarted. Move. In the arena, footwork might spell the difference between life and death. Once more, Titus gave the order. Block. Thrust. Take another step. The sun rose, sweat started to trickle. Titus showed no mercy as Fox's arm began to burn. As he walked among them, he said, "Your teacher is a pain. You're learning when your arm screams. You'll know you've learned when it stops screaming." Step, block, and thrust. Fox's shoulder burned where the brand had left scars by the 100th time. His arm felt like molten lead by the 500th. However, they persisted in using the same movements and beat around them. Other groups practiced. Proficient pupils engaged in combat with actual weapons, their battles a haze of lethal accuracy. The rhythm that accompanied the repetitions was produced by the sound of their training metal on metal, groans of struggle, and bodies hitting sand. Step, block, and thrust. Correcting someone's position with his staff, Titus remarked, "Your enemy is thought. It kills to think. Without your consent, your body must know." Ferox wanted to argue. Humans were created to think, but his blazing muscles were just ready for the next repetition, not philosophy. Step, block, and thrust. It was lunchtime. Barley, grits was so thin that it hardly qualified as food. With their wooden swords still in hand, they ate while standing and then promptly went back to their places. Even though the yard was scorching from the afternoon sun, the repetitions persisted. One newbie ventured to inquire, "Why do we train with wood?" Titus grinned, a look that caused his wounds to contort horribly. "Steel is lighter than wood. It will feel like air when you eventually get to handle a real gladius. You'll double your speed. Your adversary will perish, wondering how you were able to move so quickly." Stride, block, and thrust. By the end of the afternoon, Fox was no longer able to feel his arm being detached from the sword. Without conscious control, the weapon moved. Like an extension, his feet automatically positioned themselves. Like water flowing through a cut channel, his body moved through the moves. "Better," Titus said as he walked by. "Faster now." The pace quickened. What had been systematic turned into a frenzy. Every action sent sweat flying. Gasping replaced the breathing. However, they persisted in saying, "Thrust, block, step, faster, thrust, block, step, faster." Muscles finally refusing, a beginner fell. He was pulled to the side by guards. Nobody else halted. Compassion had been subordinated to the repetitions. Simply put, "He'll try again tomorrow," Titus remarked, "or he'll try and die." Failures as gladiators are useless in Rome. Something odd happened to Ferox as the shadows grew longer. His muscles went from burning to numbness. The weight of the wooden sword subsided. While his thoughts wandered, his body performed flawless repetitions without the assistance of his intellect. He pictured freedom, home, and trees. But in contrast to the instantaneous realism of thrust, block, and step, even those recollections seemed far away and unreal. His brain was forming new neural connections as a result of the repetitions, overwriting the people he had been with and the person they required him to become. 10,000 by the end of the week, Titus declared as night fell. "You won't remember, and you won't know how to murder by the end of the month or year." What his trainer said next would change who he was. Titus continued, "You think you're learning to fight," addressing each of them while somehow glancing at Fox. "You're not correct. Stopping being human is what you're learning. People are hesitant. People have feelings. People die. The thing we're making doesn't." Even when it was dark at the end of the training, Fox's body kept moving, making its way to the barracks. Phantom repetitions made his muscles twitch. His arm shifted slightly in his bunk as he tried to sleep. Step, block, thrust, as though he had been possessed by the training. Other gladiators around him displayed similar symptoms. Their bodies had been so deeply programmed by years of repetition that they were able to train while they slept. The mechanical change was finished. The physical training was insignificant in comparison to the mental damage they caused. Even though your dreams featured flawless swordwork, New lessons would be learned tomorrow: how to make family out of servitude, how to make brothers into corpses, and how to crave the very system that is killing you. It was referred to as familia family. However, this fabricated fraternity will turn into the most heinous network of all. "Call me father," the proprietor ordered, and for some reason, the brand didn't hurt as much as that one falsehood did. In the dining hall, Marcus Cassius Aquilus stood with his arms outstretched in a show of parental kindness in front of the gathered gladiators. Around him, 200 branded men were seated at rough wooden tables for their family meal, which was a meticulously planned exercise of control masquerading as goodwill. "You are my sons," Aquilus added, his voice brimming with well-honed love. "Your home is here in Ludus. You have brothers in these men." The perversion of the word family, which his own father had used to teach him how to hunt in Germanic forests, that now only existed in his dim memories, made his stomach flip. "We are familiar." But here, encircled by iron chains and stone walls, the word turned into a weapon more vicious than any gladiator. The system's simplicity was excellent. Take men who have lost everything, their identity, freedom, and homeland, and give them something in its place. Belonging, not independence. It was its neatly crafted shadow, not true love. Aquilus yelled to a wounded veteran, "Brutus, get up. Tell them you have been a member of our family for a long time." With the effortless assurance of an experienced survivor, the grizzled gladiator stood up. "Father, 12 years. You transformed me from a boy into a man. What do we mean to one another?" "Brothers in blood," Brutus instantly responded. "Iron family." They'd been drilled with the phrase as deeply as their sword skill. Livestock that had been trained to love their barn. Brothers in blood, family in iron, and lovely words to cover up an ugly reality. With unsettling sincerity, Aquilus's smile extended to his eyes. He most likely trusted his own fiction. There was always enough truth in the best lies to poison. "Tonight we celebrate," he declared. "Ferox starts his advanced training tomorrow. A true son of our house, not a rookie anymore." There was a burst of applause. Men who had learned to be proud of their own commodification gave them sincere applause. Fox heard voices congratulating him and felt hands slapping his back. Despite his resistance, the warmth of their acceptance seeped into him. He was reminded of home by the eyes of the woman they paired him with. One of the household slaves, Lyra, brought wine to his table. As she poured, Aquilus observed with joy that their fingertips brushed. "She's unmarked," the proprietor remarked, nonchalantly, "a prize for sons who behave well. Friendship makes you a better warrior." The math that underpinned the generosity came to light. Give gladiators someone to defend and something to lose. Relationships that would make rebellion unimaginable, as it would put not only themselves, but also the people they would come to love in jeopardy. Fox observed how other gladiators' gazes followed Lyra as she moved across the room, not out of lust but with protective devotion. She was also a part of the familia, another thread that connected them all. "We feast as equals," Aquilus added during Saturnalia. "A slave is served by a master. As the gods planned, the world inverts." Like perfume, the promise lingered in the air. They would pretend to be human for a couple of days every year. When the rigid hierarchies in Rome temporarily broke down, Ox had heard about the celebration. Slaves were free to talk, gamble with their masters, and act dignified. Everything would be completely appended during Saturnalia. At least that's what they told them. Only later will the harshness of that hope become apparent. For the time being, the gladiators soaked up the promise like rainwater on parched land. "But family means responsibility," Aquilus said, somewhat changing the tone of his voice. "Brothers look out for one another. Sons respect their dad. Family betrayal is worse than dying." The room's warmth cooled a little. Everyone was aware of the implicit danger. Gladiators who attempted to flee did not just perish. Their brothers were compelled to witness their slow, public death. You would be put to death by the same family that welcomed you. Titus held up his mug. The toast reverberated through the hall to familia. In their incarceration, 200 voices came together. The wine tasted bitter to Ferox's tongue. Lyra came to him that evening because the system promoted these kinds of couplings, not because she had an option that didn't exist here. Unbreakable chains were made when slaves fell in love. The cycle would continue as subsequent gladiators were raised from birth in the Ludus. She talked of snow and mountains in her native Thrace. She spoke with the same need that pervaded the words of all slaves. Here, they were all orphans forming new families through mutual loss. She muttered, "In the shadows, do you ever think of running?" "Every day," acknowledged Fox, but he was unable to respond. Since Titus taught with terrible gentleness, Aquilas' paternal performance had started to feel nearly real, and for the brothers who trained alongside him, the idea of departing already felt like leaving family after only a few weeks. The loot had developed into a network of connections, with romance blossoming in the shadow of slavery, mentorships based on survival, and circle friendships formed by common suffering. Every link adds a bar to an unseen cage. He realized at last after the event was over and the shackles came back. Slavery felt like kindness because they had been granted just enough dignity. They had eaten bread together that morning. Demetrius, one of them, had to perish now. She was quiet, and the practice arena's sand seemed different underfoot. It was new sand brought in for this particular use, not the well-known packed earth of everyday exercise. His shackled siblings, their features deliberately neutral, made a living wall around the square. They were aware of the regulation. If you become very emotional during an execution fight, you will be the next to go. Standing on an elevated platform, Aquilas hosted a dozen prospective sponsors, wealthy Romans looking to purchase gladiators who came to inspect the goods. A fight to the death is the ultimate way to demonstrate greatness. With a showman's flair, Aquilas declared, "Two of my finest novices. This is the culmination of 6 months of instruction. One person can go on to the games." For the first time, Ferox clutched his gladius for actual steel. Despite being lighter than the practice wood, it was purposefully heavier. Demetrius, across from him, followed suit. They had learned to kill at the same posts, arrived the same week, and were branded on the same day. They discussed their residences the previous evening. Demetrius was from coastal Greek fishing settlements. He used poetic language to describe the hue of the morning sun on the ocean. Professional evaluation was now all that was seen in those identical eyes that had glistened with remembrance. "Start," Aquilas ordered. With flawless footing from their 1,000 repetitions, they circled one another. The sponsors discussed form and potential among themselves like judges at a cattle show, while the gladiators watched in silence. Ferox easily deflected Demetrius's testing thrust, which came first. They had sparred many times and were familiar with each other's routines, but this wasn't sparring. The dogs will be fed by one of them tomorrow. The audience was unaware that they were witnessing buddies turn into murderers. This was merely quality control for the sponsors. It served as a warning and a reminder to the gladiators who were watching. It was the point at which Fox and Demetrius' humanity finally crumbled. Their motions were guided by muscle memory as they traded a barrage of assaults. The never-ending repetitions of push, block, and stride are finally fulfilling their final function. Neither was able to strike a deadly blow. They knew each other's rhythms too well and were too evenly matched. "Pathetic," said one sponsor loudly. "They are not warriors. They fight like dancers." Aquilas clenched his teeth. Less investment was made as a result of negative ratings. Fewer resources meant less investment. Blood was required by the ludus math. "Finish it," he ordered, his voice bearing the burden of financial need. Everything was altered by the command. Both gladiators comprehended, and my hesitancy now put them in danger of dying. Weaknesses that endangered profitability would not be accepted by the system. Ferox noticed the tiny indication he'd picked up during training, the change in Demetrius's stance. His preferred combination, high feint, low strike, rising thrust, was about to be tried by his pal. One would now be able to murder the other with the knowledge that had helped them both get better. Something inside him broke forever when his blade struck its mark. Not the almost anticlimactic moment of entry, when steel slid surprisingly easily between ribs. Not the warm blood on Demetrius's palms. Not his gulp of astonishment and pain. The moment their eyes locked and Demetrius gave a small nod was what snapped. One gesture that combines forgiveness, understanding, and goodbye. He was aware that the counter was approaching, but he decided not to change. He decided that Fox would not be the one to die. The Greek dropped forward, then on his knees. The circle of blood darkened the sand. The sponsors cheered as Fox stood over his friend's body, gladius dripping. One person said, "Excellent form on the killing stroke, and effective and clean. How much is his deal worth?" Aquilas grinned proudly as a father. "You can't buy that one. He is related." Fox felt the remarks as if they were actual blows. Family. He simply murdered family members for investors' amusement. He was complicit in his own downfall because of the system. The killing, however, wasn't the worst part. That's what happened. When the audience cheered, and he felt strong for the first time in his life as a slave, he was startled by the feeling. Aquilas was staring at him with true pride, as 50 gladiators cheered and sponsors nodded their approval. Their approval was like champagne to him after weeks of dehumanization. Through blood sacrifice, he had established his value and merited his position in the family. He was now hoisted up by the same system that had been grinding him down, and the psychological whiplash left him reeling. Their nonchalant efficiency allowed them to pull Demetrius's body away. The blood would be covered with fresh sand by dusk. His bunk will be occupied by a fresh recruit by tomorrow. With a limitless supply of Demetrius's and Ferox's to feed it, the machine would keep going. Titus later remarked, "Your first kill is always the hardest," as Fox stared at his still bloody hands. "The most crucial, too. There's no turning back. Now we are what you have tasted. Are we the dead men who are still moving?" In response, Titus said, "The only question is how many we take with us." Fox had a dream that night about Greek fishing villages he would never see, described by a friend he killed to gain acceptance. However, he saw a change in the way other gladiators gazed at him when the bronze bell called them to training in the morning. Fear, respect, and recognition. He had progressed from trainee to murderer. Worst of all, he was proud of himself. The addiction had started with the affirmation that accompanied violence, not with violence per se. Before long, kids would play with wooden statues of him without realizing they were holding a plaything of the most lucrative slave in Rome. 50,000 voices are calling your name. It enters your system more quickly than wine, has a longer half-life than opium. Every sound from above was amplified by the tunnel beneath the Colosseum. Ferox stood in the dark, listening to the clamor of the crowd grow louder than distant thunder. His hands quivered with anticipation rather than fear. He had been rewired by 3 years of murdering to crave what was above Ferox, Ferox, Ferox. The patrician portions were where the chant began, and it quickly spread throughout the plebeian seats. The mark they had seared into him reverberated off stone walls until it was the only name that mattered, not his own name, never that. The gate opened using a crank. He was briefly blinded by the sunlight before seeing the impossibly large scale of Roman entertainment. 50,000 faces turned to face him, a sea of people bound together by thirst for murder. Air left his lungs when the sound struck like a physical force. The crowd erupted as he raised his gladius. It was an inexplicable feeling. His bones seemed to quiver with every shout. More potent than any medicine, the collective approval of 50,000 Romans filled his mental system. He felt a tickle on his skin. His heart pounded. It seemed as though the world itself had suddenly come into focus, with colors and sounds more vibrant and distinct. They had been working for this with each repetition and deliberate act of brutality. A performer as well as a killer, a celebrity, not merely a slave. From the other gate came his adversary, a curved seeker. On a throne he was seasoned but past his best. The audience gave a half-hearted boo. They had come for their new favorite, the Germanic fighter who had brutally won 7 straight fights. That as they circled one another, Fox's awareness grew to include the entire stadium, yet he hardly saw his opponent. With every thrust and fade, he sensed the enthusiasm of the gathering growing, and he could feel their attention like heat from a furnace. The Thracian launched an attack, a last-ditch effort from a man who knew he would die. Fear was easily deflected, could have stopped there, but chose not to. The audience desired a performance. He provided them with the blood and strife they had paid for. Every well-timed dodge brought applause. Cheers were raised with each spectacular parry. In addition to fighting, he was now dancing, executing a violent dance that turned slaughter into beauty. He was adored by the audience for it. Fox, Ferox, he was that Germanic youngster who dreamed of forests, and every shout took another piece away from him. Buried beneath the thunder of Roman praise, dead Fox, the gladiator, took his position. Ferox, the performer, Ferox, the wealthy slave, had come to appreciate his chains since they were accompanied by cheers. The Colosseum exploded when he finally drove his blade deep, a dramatic lunge that sprayed blood in a perfect arc. 50,000 people were on their feet, yelling his name and scattering flowers and money on the sand. Arms raised, he stood in the middle of it all, absorbing their devotion. He was now totally consumed by his addiction. This sensation, this divine moment of complete approval, was worth every penny. It was worth his soul, freedom, and dignity. He had forgotten his true name by the time he had won 10 times. How come he would require it? There was no one with that name. A savage from the jungle who had never experienced the drug of public admiration. Fox was a notable figure. Fox was adored. Even as entertainment, Fox was important. This psychology was well understood by the sponsors. They paraded him through the streets following each triumph. The women flocked to him. He was bought drinks by men. They pleaded with kids to touch his armor. He wasn't proper for a few hours. He was divine. Then it was back to being goods, back to the jail, and back to the litas. However, The recollection of that devotion persisted, a pain more intense than any injury. He would give anything for another drink after tasting divinity. One night, Titus told him, "You're among the fortunate ones. You were selected as the crowd's choice. Most people perish in the shadows." "Fortunate?" Fox gave a sour laugh. "You still don't get it. The unlucky ones die quickly," the veteran retorted. "Those of us who are fortunate die gradually. Addiction consumes us. We get to act like we're more than meat." Though, for a time, every win exacerbated the addiction. The crowd's expectations increased. They wanted more show, more blood, more of whatever was unique. He offered it to the ravenous gods. With great pleasure and desperation, life felt subdued and gloomy in between matches. Food didn't taste well. There was no interest in conversation. Existence only made sense in the stadium, when 50,000 people were yelling his name. His sense of self had become reliant on his captors' approbation. This was expertly designed by them. In contrast to a gladiator who battled for praise, one who fought for freedom might flee or rebel. With each success, he would shackle himself more tightly, becoming dependent on the system that was killing him. Before long, kids would play with wooden statues of him without realizing they were holding a plaything that represented Rome's most lucrative slave. His name on bar walls, his face on oil lamps. Because everyone knew the slave who couldn't hide, fame turned into a jail without bars. They were on exhibit in the pottery store. Ferox's visage, with a characteristic scar across his left eyebrow, was sculpted into oil lamps. "This is real gladiator gear," the dealer declared. "Light the flame of victory in your house." Ferox, who was mass-produced and sold for 3 sesti each, gazed at his own face. His picture would burn nightly in Roman houses as housewives filled these lamps with oil. He felt ill at the concept, but he was also proud, and this was the really sick part. 23 victories, Aquilus said as he stood next to him in the marketplace. They would arrive to determine Ferox's current market value and to assess public interest. "The emperor's faces are nearly identical to yours." It hardly amounted to hyperbole. His bouts were crudely painted on the tavern walls. Children playing Ferox and the clacking of Thryon wooden swords as they reenacted his triumphs filled the streets. While he was still alive, he had turned into a myth. The prize for surviving was this: MBI's journey from slave to emblem, from person to product. Celebrities' unseen bonds were more tightly wound than any iron shackle. "My woman asks you to come," a messenger with a scented scent stated as he walked toward them in the forum. He gave a sealed letter full of pricey oils too. "The gladiator wants to be personally sponsored by the senator's wife." Dozens of these invitations had been sent to Ferox. Gladiators were deemed wonderfully exotic by aristocratic women. Between silk sheets, a skilled killer, might talk about death. The truth was more hideous. Command performances in which he stood like a prize bull, and his scars were caressed by bored patricians. To a man who slept in dirt, senatorial women wrote letters smelling of perfume while he counted days and scratches on stone walls. Others composed poems about his magnificent raw beauty. One had made a full-price offer to hire him as a personal bodyguard. Aquilus had said no. In the arena, Ferox was more valuable than in some matron's beds. "His owner ordered you to come tonight. The sponsorship of Senator Claudius may cover a whole season. Be nice, smile, and let his wife pour at you if she so chooses." With its columns, fountains, and careless riches, the senator's mansion squatted like a marble toad on the Palatine Hill. Naturally, Ferox went through the slave entrance. His basic status remained unchanged by his fame. By the time they introduced him as an unusual animal, the gathering was already full of liquor and fake laughs. The well-known Fox 23 triumphs were declared by Senator Claudius. He has never experienced defeat, so they say. People walked around him, making remarks about his body as though he didn't understand Latin. Women used painted nails to trace his scars. In an attempt to prove to their friends that they had faced a true gladiator, men challenged him to arm wrestling. He was too well known to ever be freed. Where would he flee, even if he managed to get away from the Ludas? Half of Rome's taverns were adorned with his face. It was sketched from memory by street painters. Kids could go into great detail about his fighting style. "Did you really murder 2 men with a single thrust?" Breathlessly, a young patrician asked. "Is it true that Germanic blood is colder than Roman?" "Show us a combat stance," another person asked. He displayed skills that had killed scores of people, acting like a bear with training. They never saw the horrible irony and cheered his murderous pantomime. They applauded him for using the very violence they had denounced him for. At last, The wife of Senator Claudius emerged, clad in silk valued at over 100 gladiators. She was pale, gentle, and attractive in the Roman sense, unaffected by anything more difficult than having to decide which slave would do her hair. She said, "Leave us," and everyone left the room, save for the guards at the doors. He reminded himself that he was merchandised, and she circled slowly, looking at him like that. Her purr said, "They say you're undefeated. Are you unbeatable at everything? I wonder." Like incense, the proposition hovered in the air. Refuse, and you will not be sponsored. Acknowledge and transform into a new type of underscore. In any case, his notoriety had put him in situations that could not be solved by any amount of swordplay. "My lady respects me," he said thoughtfully, with a tinkling sound comparable to breaking glass. She giggled, "But I belong to the arena. How honorable there are Roman virtues in the savage." Casually and possessively she ran her hand over his chest. "In any case, I'll sponsor you. Even if I can only appreciate beautiful things from a distance, I still like to own them." Younger gladiators at the ludus were envious of him. They witnessed the splendor, noble sponsors, his name being chanted by throngs, and his face on lamps. They failed to notice the prison it built, how his notoriety had made him too obvious to get away, and too precious to free. Another link has been added to his triumph. If he broke it, he would ruin not only himself, but also the whole economy that was based on his fame. Businesses that sell his image and sponsors who put money into his wins. Due to the creation of Ferox the Undefeated, the Ludes itself is now well known. He was too well known to ever be free. He was a slave to his own myth. A lucrative fabrication that Rome would exploit to the last drop of blood had supplanted the kid from Gematia. His body maintained a ledger of damage from 43 fights, which, according to mathematics, could only be balanced in one direction. Torn shoulder tendons, a broken left knee, and a painful arm that shook in the mornings. Every injury represented a withdrawal from an unrefillable account. Ferox awoke to the pain he knew so well. Even when will didn't, his body served as a constant reminder that flesh had its limitations. His background was etched in grinding joints and scar tissue from 6 years of arena battle. When he placed weight on his left knee, which had been broken in his 15th fight and had never fully healed, it screamed, with every movement. The shoulder tendons that had been ripped during a battle with a Richelieu shot lightning through his arm. But he was most frightened by the tremor. At his peak, his sword hand was as steady as stone, but now it trembled every morning like an elderly man's. After warm-ups, the trembling normally subsided, but it took longer every day. It would soon not fade at all. All around him, the similar deterioration was evident in other veterans. In the winter, Marcus, who had previously been Rome's fastest gladiator, he now moved like honey. Quintus had taken too many knocks to the head and had lost his peripheral vision. It was only a matter of time till undeath came from his blind side. Titus suggested, "Hide it better." After observing Fox's difficulties during morning exercises, "The moment they see weakness, you're done." However, concealment became more difficult every day. Fox was heavily indebted, and the organization maintained its own accounting. Each stroke tugged at scar tissue. Each block jolted injured joints. Opponents would have noticed the fractions that had hampered his famous speed. The doctor, a Greek slave who had studied medicine by treating gladiators, listed the injuries in the ludus's rudimentary infirmary: severe tendon damage in the rotator cuff, brain trauma from repeated impacts, microfractures throughout the right tibia, and cartilage gone in the left knee. For what length of time? The doctor shrugged when Ferox asked. "Your body ought to have stopped 2 years ago. Willpower by itself keeps you going, but when your reflexes fail, it won't stop a sword." Everything in the arena was governed by mathematics. Heartbeats are used to quantify reaction time. Footsteps are used to calculate speed. The length of time you could keep your guard up was a measure of strength. Fox had established a reputation for outpacing opponents in strength, speed, and tenacity. These benefits are now being lost every day. His opponent was 19, brand new, and intact, and 19 discovered everything he was no more. That morning, the match had been announced. Ajax, the up-and-coming talent, versus Ferox the veteran. The audience would anticipate that the old torches will give way to the new ones. They were unaware that they would be seeing an execution. Ajax practiced at the other part of the yard, his movements smooth and effortless, unhindered by 6 years of accumulated injury, quivering hands, or grinding joints. He battled with the easy haughtiness of someone who had never experienced physical betrayal, joining Ferox at the water bucket and assessing if you still had one more fight left in you. Brutus remarked, I've seen that look before, do I? With eyes that had seen hundreds of deaths, the older gladiator examined him. In the third exchange, your knee will give out. Your blind spot on the left will be visible to him. You blink excessively on that side as a result of the head trauma. After 5 to 6 minutes, your stamina will start to wane. He is capable of fighting for 20. Mortality's mathematics computed with ruthless accuracy. Had always anticipated this day. No graceful retirements were permitted in the arena. You battled till you were unable to. Then you passed away. The number of victories you accrued before the inevitable was the sole variable. 50,000 spectators leaned forward as he stumbled in the sand. The time had come. Weakness on the part of the enormous fox. Damage was done, but he swiftly recovered and converted the stumble into a tactical roll. The water was now concentrated on blood. Ajax would launch a confident offensive. In the middle of the arena, they circled one another, and Fox felt each injury at the same time. The injured knee was on the verge of giving way. With every movement of the sword, the ripped shoulder screamed. He had to focus constantly to keep his hand from trembling. Ajax used youth's explosive force to strike, and Fox just managed to deflect it in time. His entire skeleton was shaken by the impact, with broken joints rubbing against one another. Another blow, another last-ditch deflection. The younger gladiator became aware of this, and his eyes brightened. The mythical Aaron Vesser was actually mortal. The audience also sensed it. The quality of their cheers changed. More anticipation and less rejoicing. They would be there to witness history, either Fox's biggest triumph or his downfall. Both would be entertaining. The treachery of his body was now complete. It was too late for reflexes that had saved his life innumerable times. Power that had overpowered adversaries evaporated like water from a broken cup. His demise was now assured by the same flesh that had brought him profit. Ajax exerted pressure. Attacks were coming more quickly than Fox's injured body could keep up. When the left knee finally failed, he fell to the beach. Rome became silent. As the point of the younger gladiator's sword struck his throat, the scream of the crowd turned into a flurry of sideways, up, down, and thumbs. However, only one thumb was important, and that thumb belonged to the editor, who would determine if he had merited death by calculating his value in denarii. There was a cost to even his blood. Gladiator blood was taken while still warm and sold. 2 epileptics who thought it would help them with their shaking for a cool 20 dinars per cup. With Ajax's blade at his throat, the editor crouched in the sand, his thumb hovering. 50,000 Romans held their breath around them. The editor, however, was not paying attention to the crowd. 43 triumphs meant a great deal of renown, he calculated. Even after death, fame had commercial value. Perhaps 30 glasses before coagulation would be filled with the blood. Alone 20 dinars per cup from PIIE to desperate epileptics. 600 dinars from blood alone. Gladiator meat was highly valued by the flesh market. Senators felt that they gained strength by absorbing a warrior's strength. Ferox's body would produce an additional 1,000 denarii in select cuts at today's prices. The highest bidder, most likely an aristocracy looking for bravery, would receive the heart in particular. The powdered bones were combined with wine and marketed as aphrodisiacs. 300 more denarii. Even the rendered fat was valuable. It was utilized in cosmetics and medications. There would be no waste. The thumb made a downward motion. Ferox's throat was expertly cut open by Ajax's blade. Attendants hurried forward with collection cups as blood spilled down the sand. It took only a few seconds to go from warrior to commodity. A man 1 minute, just valuable meat the next. Tonight, senators would eat his flesh and talk politics in between bites. They would never consider the person they were eating when they paid 50 denarii a pound for a gladiator steak. Like dormice in honey or peacock tongues, this is just another treat for cynical palates. In the subterranean bowels of the Colosseum, the butchers worked with a methodical efficiency. They were skilled at separating meat from bone, having processed hundreds of gladiators, how to package the hideous desires of nobles. Ferox's body, which had withstood 43 battles, fell easily to their blades. Professionally, one butcher commented, "Good marbling. The flavor is enhanced by the last bite." Each tiny vial containing his blood was labeled with his name and the number of victories, because they thought the energy of gladiators might heal their ailments. Epileptics would drink it warm. It was prescribed by doctors, it was hoarded by collectors. People in dire need spent a lot of money on it. At the same time, Ferox's blood became myth, medicine, and merchandise. The bones underwent many procedures, including cleaning, drying, and grinding into a finer powder than flour. They would be marketed as virility enhancers when combined with wine. In an attempt to stay young, elderly men would drink Fox's calcium, without realizing they were drinking crushed despair. While his name faded to myth, strangers would be strengthened by his bones. Eventually, the oil lamps adorned with his image would shatter. The paintings in the tavern would deteriorate. Even in death, he was profitable for the time being, but new gladiators would emerge to vie for Rome's erratic attention. The merchant weighed packages of flesh and judged it to be of excellent grade. This one exercised hard and ate well. The price of the meat will be very high. They served him on silver dishes at a senator's banquet that evening. The aristocrats who applauded his triumphs now ate his flesh, remarking on its flavor, texture, and the symbolic significance of consuming a warrior. I could feel his strength entering me, one woman said. The final accounting was accurate. 600 dinars is sold for blood, 1,000 denarii for flesh, 300 dinars for bones and byproducts. The fox's body was worth 1,900 denarii in total. His death brought in 1,500 dinars for the looters after costs, which is more than 10 times the initial purchase price. However, the earnings did not stop there. Something worse was made possible by his death. The acquisition of 12 new males, 10 more than he had 6 years prior, including a Jik youngster that cost 130 dinars. The rising popularity of the arena was reflected in the inflation of human pricing. More gladiators meant more games, which in turn meant more youths who became lucrative corpses. His death financed something much worse 3 days after they scraped his blood from the beach. The acquisition of 12 new guys, 10 more than he had 6 years prior, including a GIC youngster that cost 130 denarii. The decision made the instant. A 16-year-old Germanic lad marked with a hot iron was sealed after the editor's thumb finished descending. The audience erupted not out of pity for the warrior who had died, but rather out of delight at the sight of death. They had received value for their money. The machines of commodification worked with trained efficiency as Ferox's blood seeped into the sand. Arriving with collection vessels, attendants took care to avoid wasting any of the precious fluid. The change from Rome's renowned murderer to Rome's newest creation was complete and instantaneous. His blood was being pricked and bottled in a matter of minutes. His flesh would be on noble tables in a matter of hours. His bones would be powdered and sold in the small stores of the Subura within days. His life had been robbed of 6 years of amusement by the system. It would now draw the final sayus from his demise. As merchants talked about his potential, the young Jik kid stood in the slave market with his wrists chained. Excellent reflexes, strong shoulders, and ideal training. Age, as it had for ages and will for generations to come, the cycle started over. He was 130 dinars. Ferox had been bought for 120, and the human market had null inflation, reflecting the arena's rising demands. Because the equipment was now more effective, the procedure more sophisticated, and the earnings more definite, this boy had more authority. That afternoon, they branded him. Another identity died, and the iron sizzled against flesh. A new product was created. He would be given a combat name, like Pugnex or Valodis, which would sound impressive if spoken by 50,000 people. He would also kneel in blood-soaked sand in 6 years, or perhaps 8 if he was lucky, as an editor determined his ultimate value. Epileptics would be cured by his blood. Senators would eat his flesh. Older guys would be promised virility by his bones. One more human being turned into a commodity. Another life reduced to numbers. The arena never vanished, but it did change shape. The only distinction is that we now refer to it as entertainment rather than execution. And the gladiators offer their services. At least the Romans were forthright about their cruelty. They admitted that they were witnessing people destroying themselves for their own amusement. The transaction made sense to them. Death for profit, blood for entertainment. Present-day viewers conceal themselves behind screens and data, supposing that our intake of human devastation is somehow more civilized. However, the math is still the same. The machine is filled with young corpses. They are converted into goods by the system. Their devastation is consumed by the spectators. The next generation of victims is financed by profits. Denial and inefficiency are the only evolution. Fox thought he had been a warrior when he passed away. That's what the GIC lad would die thinking. There were thousands before and countless after them. All of them were feeding a machine that turned human potential into destructive profit. The flesh still sizzles even though the brand is now business logos rather than slave markings. Even now, identity dies. The audience continues to yell for blood. The arena remained